When police entered the quiet home in Oxted, they found a teenage boy sitting calmly in his room, and the body of a young woman, brutally murdered. His explanation: he said Dexter told him to do it. In that moment, a small English town was ripped from innocence into a nightmare pulled straight from the screen. This wasn't a random killing, it wasn't a stranger in the night. It was a teenager, 16 years old, who believed he was living inside a TV show, and the girl who trusted him would never walk out alive. Tonight, we rewind to the crime scene, to the voices, to the confession that stunned detectives. Because this isn't just another true crime case. This is the chilling story of Stephen Miles, the killer teen inspired by Dexter. If you think you've heard every chilling story, wait until you hear what Stephen Miles confessed. Subscribe now, because the next case we uncover might just be one you help solve. Her name was Elizabeth Thomas, 17 years old. Bright, warm, full of life. The kind of girl who lit up a room with her smile. She grew up in Oxted, a quiet town in Surrey just outside of London. Neighbors knew each other. Families walked the same streets for generations. It was the kind of place where people said, "Nothing bad ever happens here." Elizabeth blended right into that life. She was relatable, the kind of teenager everyone could see themselves in. Friends remember her laugh. Her family remembers her last text. Ordinary words. A simple smiley face at the end. But behind that ordinary day was a decision that would change everything. Elizabeth agreed to meet a friend. Just a normal visit, like countless before. No one watching her that morning, no one who saw her walk down the street, could have imagined it would be her final moments. What she didn't know was that inside the walls of her friend's home, danger was already waiting. To most people in Oxted, Stephen Miles was invisible, just another face in the crowd of teenagers. He wasn't the class clown, he wasn't the popular athlete, he wasn't the kid teachers celebrated in school assemblies. He was quiet, withdrawn, a boy who walked the hallways with his head down, his earbuds in, lost in a world of his own. But that private world wasn't filled with daydreams of music or games. Stephen's world was darker. His obsession was with a TV show, Dexter, a series built around a charming forensic analyst who by night became a meticulous serial killer. To Stephen, it wasn't just entertainment, it was a blueprint. He didn't just watch Dexter, he studied it. He replayed episodes. He analyzed Dexter's rituals, his planning, his secrecy, his kills. And slowly, it became more than television. It became an identity. Stephen began writing, not poetry, not stories, but notebooks filled with violent fantasies. In the margins were sketches of knives, bodies, and scenes of blood. He drew characters, only to cross them out violently with jagged strokes of red ink. Page after page read like a diary of destruction. And yet, to the outside world, Stephen was just a boy with quirks. Friends said he talked about killing, about death, about the voices in his head. But they brushed it off. They thought he was joking. Because what 16-year-old really means it when they talk about murder? Stephen meant it. He told people about his darker side. An alter ego, he said, lived within him. He called it Ed. To Stephen, Ed wasn't just a name. Ed was another person. Another voice. One that urged him to act out the darkest desires he scribbled in his notebooks. A split identity. One face for the world, another face hidden in shadows. Elizabeth Thomas didn't see that side of him. She saw a boy who was awkward, maybe strange, but still her friend. She had no reason to fear him. Why would she? He was 16. He smiled sometimes. He made sarcastic jokes. To Elizabeth, Stephen was harmless. But in Stephen's mind, the harmless mask was slipping. The Dexter fantasies weren't enough. The voice of Ed was getting louder. He wasn't just imagining the kill, he was preparing for it. Investigators would later find disturbing notes, plans, lists, a methodical path toward murder. Stephen wasn't living in reality anymore. He was already living in Dexter's world. He wasn't just watching Dexter, he believed he was becoming him. And Elizabeth couldn't see it. She couldn't see that her friend was no longer just Stephen, that every laugh, every conversation, every text was another step toward a moment she would never walk away from. Because when Stephen Miles opened his door to Elizabeth that day, it wasn't Stephen who answered, it was Ed. Elizabeth and Stephen had known each other for some time. In a small town like Oxted, it wasn't unusual for teenagers to cross paths again and again, at school, at gatherings, walking the same streets. Elizabeth was friendly, open. the kind of person who saw good in people. Stephen, despite his awkwardness, was someone she let into her circle. To Elizabeth, he was just a friend, a boy she could hang out with, talk to, share music with. She had no reason to fear him. She trusted him enough to visit his home. She trusted him enough to believe she was safe. But underneath that fragile teenage friendship was something Elizabeth couldn't see. To her, their time together was ordinary. To Stephen, it was the staging ground for something darker. He spoke to others about it, friends, classmates. He told them he had a voice inside his head. He said it wasn't him. He said it was someone else, an alter ego, whispering commands, urging him to kill. People laughed. They brushed it off. They thought it was Stephen being dramatic, or strange, or maybe even just trying to get attention. Nobody believed it could be real. Nobody thought to warn Elizabeth. Imagine being 17, spending time with a friend who joked about killing, who talked about voices. Would you take it seriously? Most people didn't. And that silence, the disbelief, would cost Elizabeth everything. Because what Elizabeth saw as a normal teenage friendship was, in truth, a mask. Behind the laughter, behind the conversations, Stephen's obsession was growing. His mind was split between reality and the world of Dexter. And in that hidden world, Elizabeth's trust made her the perfect victim. By the time anyone realized Stephen wasn't joking, it was already too late. Elizabeth was walking straight into the grip of a boy who no longer knew where television ended, and where his own darkness began. December 4th, 2014. It began like any other winter afternoon in Oxted. The town was quiet, the streets familiar. Elizabeth Thomas was just 17. She texted a friend, smiled at a neighbor, and walked toward Stephen Miles's house. To her, it was nothing unusual, just another visit with someone she knew, a boy she trusted. Inside, the house was still. Stephen greeted her. Their voices rose and fell like any teenagers. Music played faintly from a phone speaker. They laughed about small things, school, TV shows, songs. It was a picture of normalcy. To Elizabeth, it felt safe. But beneath that calm, Stephen was carrying something else. He wasn't improvising. He wasn't acting on impulse. Every detail had already been written in his notebooks. Every step, rehearsed in his mind. For him, this wasn't an afternoon. This was an episode. One he'd been waiting to play out. At some point, Stephen excused himself. He walked down the hall, past the family photos, past the ordinary furniture of a suburban home. He knew exactly where he was going. To the place where he had hidden a knife. The blade was waiting. Cold steel, silent. Stephen picked it up, with the same calm he used to turn on the TV. He returned to the room. Elizabeth was still there, smiling, talking, unaware that in just seconds her world would vanish. He stood over her, and then, without hesitation, he attacked. Elizabeth had no warning, no time to scream for help, no time to understand why the boy she trusted had turned into her killer. In moments, her life was taken. Stolen by someone who believed he wasn't himself, but a character from television. And, when it was over, Stephen didn't collapse, he didn't run, he didn't cry. He walked into the next room, to his sister, his voice cold, flat. He said, "It's done." At first, his sister froze. Then panic hit. She grabbed the phone and dialed 999, the UK's emergency line. Her words spilled out to the dispatcher. She could hardly breathe, hardly make sense of the horror she had just heard. But the message was undeniable. Her brother had killed. Police cars were dispatched instantly. Sirens pierced the quiet streets of Oxted. Neighbors looked out from their windows, confused by the sudden rush of flashing blue lights. In a place where crime was rare, they couldn't imagine what was waiting behind that door. Officers braced themselves as they entered the home. They expected chaos, panic, a terrified teen realizing what he had done. But when they found Stephen, he wasn't panicked. He wasn't even nervous. He was calm, almost proud. The first responding officers approached the Miles home with urgency. They had been told a murder had taken place inside. Still, nothing could prepare them for what they were about to see. They entered cautiously. The hallway was eerily quiet. No shouting, no crashing, just silence. The kind of silence that tells you something is terribly wrong. As they moved down the narrow corridor, the smell of blood filled the air, and then they saw her. Elizabeth Thomas, 17 years old. Her body had been wrapped tightly in cling film, as if she were an object, not a human being. A blanket was thrown over her, a futile attempt to conceal what had been done. She had been betrayed by a boy she trusted. Detectives described the scene as cold, clinical. There was no sign of struggle left in the room, no chaos, just the stillness of death, and the quiet presence of her killer. Stephen Miles was in his bedroom, his hands and clothes stained with Elizabeth's blood. But his face showed no fear, no shock, no trace of panic. He looked at the officers as though this was expected, as though this was part of the script, and then, in a voice flat and detached, he confessed. He said, "I had to do it. Dexter made me." A 16-year-old boy, claiming a television character had commanded him to murder. For detectives, it was a moment of disbelief. The line between fiction and reality blurred so completely that it had cost a young girl her life. What Stephen had once scribbled in notebooks, fantasies of killing, voices urging him, was now horrifyingly real. Outside, word spread quickly. Sirens cut through the quiet streets of Oxted. Blue lights lit up houses that, just hours before, had seemed so ordinary. Families stepped outside, whispering in shock. Parents clutched their children closer. Neighbors traded glances of disbelief. This was Oxted, a place of safety, a place where crime was rare and murder was unthinkable. And yet, in one night, it had become the stage for a tragedy that sounded more like a script than real life. One neighbor said later, "This doesn't happen here." But it had, and it shattered the illusion of safety for everyone who lived there. The clash was impossible to ignore, fiction and reality colliding in the most brutal way. A teenager who believed he was Dexter, and a young girl who believed she was safe with her friend. Elizabeth Thomas's body lay still beneath a blanket. Stephen Miles sat calmly in his room, proud of what he had done, and as detectives led him away, one question echoed louder than all the rest. How could this have happened? By the time the case reached trial in early 2015, the nation was watching. A 16-year-old boy accused of killing his friend. A courtroom about to hear the details of how fantasy had turned into murder. The courtroom was solemn. The wood panels, the cold benches, the silent gallery. Journalists filled the back rows. Family members of both Stephen and Elizabeth sat only feet apart, separated by grief, fear, and anger. The prosecution opened with a simple but devastating statement. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of madness. This was murder, cold, calculated, inspired not by voices but by obsession. One by one, prosecutors laid out their evidence. They showed the jury notebooks filled with Stephen's violent fantasies. They pointed to sketches of knives, drawings of bodies. They read aloud the chilling lines he had written about killing. And then, they reminded the jury of Stephen's own words on the day of the murder. "I had to do it. Dexter made me." The argument was clear. Stephen Miles wasn't confused. He wasn't out of control. He was in control. He wanted to kill. And he chose Elizabeth. But the defense told a different story. They painted Stephen as a sick teenager, a boy lost in a fractured mind. They said he suffered from schizophrenia, that the alter ego he called Ed wasn't a lie, it was a symptom. They argued he wasn't a killer in his own right, but a patient who had fallen victim to his illness. This was the clash at the heart of the trial. Was Stephen a cold-blooded murderer inspired by a TV show? Or was he a child consumed by mental illness, unable to separate reality from hallucination? Witnesses were called. Detectives described walking into the crime scene, their voices steady but heavy with memory. They told the jury how they found Elizabeth's body wrapped in cling film, how Stephen sat calmly nearby, blood on his hands, how he spoke, not with panic, but with pride. Family members sat frozen as photographs of the scene were shown in court. Some wept silently, others turned away unable to watch. For Elizabeth's parents, every word, every image was another wound, another reminder that their daughter was gone. Then came Stephen himself. In the courtroom he appeared detached, hollow. When asked about what he had done, he spoke of voices, of Ed, of an alter ego that urged him to kill. He didn't cry, he didn't plead, he simply described the act as if it had been inevitable. It was the absence of emotion that haunted the room. No remorse, no grief. Just the cold repetition of a boy convinced that his crime had been scripted by something outside himself. For the jury, the question loomed larger with each day. Was Stephen Miles a manipulator, using television and voices as an excuse? Or was he truly lost in a psychosis so deep, he no longer knew what was real? Elizabeth's family didn't care about the arguments. For them, there was only one truth: their daughter was gone, murdered by someone she trusted. No illness, no obsession, no television character could ever excuse that. The trial stretched on, each testimony adding to the weight of the decision. Reporters scribbled notes. Observers leaned forward. Every word carried the gravity of justice, or the fear of it slipping away. And when the arguments closed, the courtroom fell silent. Everyone knew a verdict was coming. Everyone knew a sentence awaited. But no one, neither family, nor neighbors, nor the public, would ever leave that courtroom unchanged.